Okay, let's kick it off. A wonderful good afternoon or good morning wherever you are in the world. Wonderful to have so many of you here again, and welcome to this brief webinar on commercial contracting, particular for non-profit organizations. Thank you very much for continuing to be so active in the MzN events, digital as well as in person. I hope that you will find this conversation equally as valid and important and helping your thoughts as you develop your organizations. Now, very briefly, my name is Chris. I'm the actual founder of MzN. I'm by far, and thank God, no longer alone since we started 10 years ago. MzN, as you may already know, is all about building better NGOs, a particular focus on funding and strategy and organizational development. And around the world, across 16 countries or so, where my colleagues are now based, some of them you see in the bottom left here, we have the immense pleasure and honor to focus and to partner with many NGOs around the world and national NGOs in order to develop funding plans, strategic initiatives, and organizational developments and build better organizations. Now, this conversation sits right at the intersection between organizational development and funding, and it's aiming at commercial contracting. And before we start, let me just clarify the term. Many of you will have heard the term, many of you understand possibly different things underneath it. Commercial contracts is any tender, any contract won where there is a fee rather than a grant, where the organization that implements something earns based on services or results delivered. Now, they can come from institutional donors who also issue grants. They can come from other organizations, and obviously they mostly focus on development and aid work, which is what we all care about. However, the big difference is here that rather than paying for a program to be delivered, a commercial contract is usually paying for services rendered. What they do thematically can actually be very similar, whether it's WASH, securitization, anti-discrimination, refugee aid, food nutrition, that can actually be very, very similar. And that is why commercial contracts are of interest to many NGOs in the world. Excuse me for 1 second. Well, there we are. I must have eaten something wrong. So let's dive right into it. The format of this webinar is that I've got about 6 to 7 slides to share. So hopefully we're through this in the next 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll hopefully open up this time to questions and answers. I can see we've got people signing in here from New York, from UK, from Spain, from South Africa. Wonderful to see you all. And hopefully we can answer as many questions as we can. In order to allow me to do that, please use the Q&A function at the very bottom so that we can answer them first come, first serve. Later on, you will also be allowed to unmute or be able to speak if you want to ask your question directly. Now, finally, please note that this webinar is recorded and we have closed captioning activated for anybody who requires any aid and to make this webinar barrier free. The recording of this webinar will be shared with you via the MzN channels later if you want to. Good. That's it. Then let's kick it off. And please remember the Q&A function at any time for the questions you may have. Right. First of all, why should we care? There are many good reasons why an organization, a non-profit organization, might go for a commercial contract. Basically, is that the commercial contract opportunities far exceed those of grant allocations, and so they could become a major funding source. As I said, the topics of commercial contracts are very often very much the same as the one of grants, but obviously a commercial contract is a lot easier for the donor, or in that case, the contractor, to administer and to put out for bidding. It's not surprising, therefore, that when we look at the total amount of funding available for a variety of social, planetary, and justice goals in the world, commercial contracts far exceed those, that amount of funding that is available in grants of any way sort. So really the question is, we're going to have to be very good at justifying where we don't go for it, rather than asking whether we should. There's also a more systematic risk. If NGOs do not adapt to be able to attract and manage commercial contracts, then there's a risk that the development aid sector is becoming simply too commercial. And that in turn has a risk on those we care about most, the most marginalized, sort of the last mile of actions. The risk, the fact is that current contractors obviously focus on contracts where the risk is manageable in order to get fully paid. That means marginalized communities or services that are last mile orientated, they have less of an interest in attracting these. And we wouldn't want that. So there is this moral imperative as well as a funding imperative why everybody might want to at least look at and develop a strategy to develop commercial contracts. Very happy to provide some examples on this one. I'm working with a sort of medium-sized INGO at the moment. They are launching a commercial contract strategy, and the fact that the funding is so much more than the grants is a big reason of it, as well as the fact that they can reach people through commercial contracts that through grants they couldn't. So it's a programmatic as well as a financial motivation. And you might find yourself in a similar situation of motivation. Good. Assuming you do want to go for it and you do agree with these reasons, and there are more, then there's 6 tips I want to share, sort of things to look out for. And they may sound a little bit negative, but I really don't want to discourage you. The first one is get ready and do that seriously. Getting a contract, getting commercial contract ready is no easy task. You need to be able to contract. Do we know our costings in terms of the budget? More on that later. Most importantly, strategically, do we hit the sweet spot between our programmatic focus, i.e. the people and the issue we care about, and our commercial viability? Not all contracts will do that, as not all grants do that. So we must make sure that the commercial contracts don't change the NGO's core DNA and value, but really serve the NGO's mandate and earn unrestricted funding. If that sweet spot has been found, then we need to develop and define a really realistic plan. This is a medium to long-term engagement. This will not happen in a year. This is a usual strategy period which we are recommending, goes anything between 2 to 4 years. If we are not very strong thematically or want to enter a new geographic area, then we're looking at the upper end of that scale. If we are pretty much doing the same thing commercially through commercial contracts as we have done through grants, then we're looking at the lower end of that scale. Now, we need to lose a few words about our competitors. The grants place is very competitive, intense as well, and as is the commercial tender part. One of the best tips I came across and was taught to me is really not to mirror the competition. You really want to make your non-profit status a value add to your bid. So don't mirror it. Add the capacity, the system, the processes you need to complement your existing practice as a non-profit organization. Define and communicate the fact that you're a non-profit and make that play to your advantage. Many NGOs have obviously a lot more advantages over commercial contractors. If they are going for a bid, one of them is that they are usually demanding less of a profit and that they usually have more of a local presence or network. That in itself is a huge competitive advantage, and that needs to be coming out in the bid. Good. Moving on, we really want to be prepared before we kick it off. And once we are prepared, I can only recommend to commit to making fast decisions. That is not an innate ability that many NGOs have, but there needs to be a tight timeline, make a go or no-go decision, typically within 2 to 5 days, 3 to 7 days, it says here on the slides, which means we either go for this bit commercial development or we do not. So this is quite a quick turnaround. Bear in mind the average length of an average commercial contract between release and submission is only around about 28 days. So that's not a lot of time. If it takes you 7 days to make a decision whether or not to go for it, that doesn't need much time to develop a well-rounded professional bid. Now, many NGOs we work with struggle with the administrative burden of convincing officers that whose donor this contract would be. So, for example, an international alliance for the UK office needs to be convinced to go for this FCDO, used to be DFID, or in Germany, GIZ bid. Now, that needs to be clarified in advance, who is going for a commercial contract in an international alliance, so that that doesn't hold up the development. Anybody here who works in an international organization will probably know what I am hinting at here. In other words, there needs to be a streamlined process for this decision to be made in a few days and not weeks. That is, of course, unless you already know that there are a few large commercial contracts in the pipeline. And that is usually the case for the large ones. We now know, for example, the EU framework contracts are all coming out this summer. They're going to be valid for the next 5 years or 3 to 5 years, depending on their extension. And we've known that since several months. So if you are not preparing for those now, then you probably have made the decision not to go for those, and that's okay too. If you do decide to go for those and similar ones, there still needs to be a very streamlined process to make a fast decision whether go or not go. Good. Now, the other way is budget. And I appreciate that I'm an accountant talking about budgets, and that can easily go into a whole lecture. But budgeting is usually where we spend most of our time, and most misunderstandings appear when we talk about a conversion from grants to commercial contracts. And I guess the usual way is that NGOs are pretty used to working with a sort of capped cost budget, and then they add an unrestricted fee or a management fee, and both are set by the donor. So FCDO, for example, or the European Union, they give you the direct cost plus 7 to 8 to 10%, depending on which donor we are talking about. That is the way that NGOs are used to operating. And that is the way that we've built our entire development and funding department around. That is changing. Commercial contracts do not, I repeat, they do not usually come with a predetermined price tag. Rather, the bidders put simply their most innovative, their most cost-effective, and their most relevant cost structure to suit the project. So rather than getting in on developing a project based on a predetermined budget set by the donor, we need to build the budget from the bottom up. Our direct costs, our management costs, and then our surplus that we need. That is a different way of budgeting and a different way of project planning that many nonprofit professionals need to have time to get the thinking around. That usually consumes a lot more time than one thinks in the first 2 or 3 bids. We've witnessed this a couple of times earlier this year and last year. So plan additional time in there, particularly again with what I said earlier, making a decision early on and investing that saved time in the budgeting process. Now, payments by results also needs to be understood. There's a lot of commercial contracts which pay not by time or don't pay in advance, but they pay by results. Most people will be familiar with this, but it needs to be planned out. It means you may need to pre-fund some activities before the first payment comes in. Finally, there needs to be a reasonable budget, and there needs to be a very clear commitment to this change in thinking and detailed knowledge. So we need to provide some training in our organization, and we need to know our own cost base very well. One of the greatest sticking points we have with many NGOs is when we ask the question, well, what does this and this person cost per month? They don't know, and it's more than just a salary, as you know. So we need to know our own costings in quite a lot of detail in advance of submitting a budget to be able to budget and plan something that is then reasonable and, you know, provides us the unrestricted funding we want. Good, so that's a big highlight here on the budgeting. Please do not underestimate that. Okay, almost done. Alliances. That is not massively dissimilar from the grants, although it's probably more important in the commercial contracts. Rarely does a lead agency implement a project alone. You know, usually there is alliances, subcontracts, consortia. They're pretty much the norm, particularly for the large commercial framework contracts or the large commercial bids coming out this summer. Now, I appreciate that NGOs are extremely accustomed to working with these what we call through partners or implementation partners. For commercial contracts, they need to be even better organized. They need to be signed before the contract the bid is put together. There needs to be a lot of different project planning. There needs to be responsibilities with all the implementation partners agreed in writing in advance. Obviously, you can do that for more than just one commercial contract, so to save yourself the effort next time around if you're submitting something very similar. That makes total sense. But that alliance building and that strengthening of the alliance, including the head of terms agreement, including the liability agreement, including the delivery and the service excellence that the lead agency expects, that is usually requires to be tighter than with a grant. Because if there's any fault in the execution, there simply won't be any reimbursement or any payment coming. That is obviously therefore very important. Good. And then almost last but not least, how am I on time? I'm doing all right on time. There is a different mentality with a service contract and a commercial contract from a grant. There are different requirements on the administration to reporting to management, and they are often more onerous. I know that seems scarcely possible for some of the grants, but in order to secure and implement successful service agreements or commercial contracts, we need to have a close look at our administrative reporting capacity to make sure we don't just meet, but exceed the requirements of the service contract. And that is because the donor here is less of a partner, less of a governmental donor who just gives money for a program and behaves more like a client who expects excellent customer service to satisfy taxpayer demands. They are really comparing and contrasting quite a lot more than with the grants, and not just satisfying, but exceeding this donors or this client's expectations is critically important for your next commercial contract you want to secure. As far as long-term success really goes, what my colleagues and I are experiencing is that really a completely new project management mindset is required. One that is far more focused on results and far more focused on service delivery. It is not rocket science. It can certainly be done. We've seen it being done very successfully for a lot of NGOs. But it does need to be planned and executed rather than just happen, or it just won't. Good. That's pretty much the 6 tips. I promised 20 minutes. I'm pretty much on time with that. I'm pleased about that. There are more events and more blogs coming up. Check out the website. I think the next webinar is on the 25th of May at 2 p.m. CEST. And obviously the Agile NGO course is online, the podcast as well, that many of you enjoy. I hope you find these useful. Let's have a look at the questions. Meanwhile, I will just stop the sharing so you can see my face. There we are. And we have 2 questions in there. We can dive into the slides as you see fit. And let me just allow everybody to speak up in case you want to as well. Just raise your hand if you want to talk. Just 1 second. quite a lot of you coming up. Not. So as I said, if you don't want to type but just ask a question, feel free to raise your hand and unmute so that we can talk about it. Meantime, whilst you think with your questions, I'm going to look into the Q&As. An anonymous attendee asked, can you explain again the part about the administrative burden? Sure. The administrative burden in a grant is usually that of retrospective explanation of the costs and what you have done. So you need to go basically back to the expense verification and looking back at what was done, explaining that in detail, justifying the expenditure, and then reporting on it. In a commercial contract, it is often far more dynamic, and you need to, no, actually, you might not be contractually required to, but it is a lot more advantageous if you have more of a forward-thinking management approach, saying this is where we draw resources into, we will allocate funding here. We've engaged with this new beneficiary group or users group. We are looking to maximize the impact from our activities in the next quarter by doing X or that. So you can see by the language already, it's a lot more forward-looking and a lot more strategic in nature, and that requires a lot more administrative and reporting and planning capacities, because the retrospective expense accounting is basically only for your internal purposes. You have a fixed price upon which you do that anyway. So the donor doesn't really care. Another anonymous attendee asked, could you please tell us more about the EU framework agreements coming up? Yeah, the framework agreements are coming up this summer. Are the large ones, 9 or 10 lots coming up in June. They should have come up in May, and they've extended them. This is the last extension, so we're expecting them in June or July. You probably heard that the EU is having its European Development Days next month. We're expecting the framework contracts to be released around that time, and they're all commercial, as you know, and they are the single largest framework contracts that the EU External Action does, and the development aid services. Usually, if you are looking at being involved, you would partner with a lead agency that has had similar framework contracts in the past. But as far as I'm aware, most of these consortia have been done already. If not, please reach out and we can see whether we get you in one of those. Right, Andrew. Andrew Almond asked the question, you mentioned in the intro that commercial contracts don't pay for programs to be delivered, but rather pay for services. That's right. How do you define the difference between programs and services? It's a really good question, Andrew. Thank you for asking it. And you're quite right in pointing out where is the difference. So to answer the question, a grant usually is paid for by the donor in order to deliver a program, whereas in a commercial contract scenario, the donor usually wants certain outcomes or certain services delivered. So for example, a typical commercial contract is capacity building Justice Ministry Eastern Europe, or water and sanitation infrastructure building in East Africa. A grant is usually more focused on the activities that will be sorted, whereas a service contract is usually far more focused on the outcome. So they say things like provide fresh water for 10,000 people living there. Improve capacity of the ministry by some measurement there. How you go about this is then mostly up to you. They may require certain standards to be met, usually DIN standards or quality standards that are common in this sector, but usually they let you decide how to achieve this impact far more. So they pay for the services and the impact that they want to see, rather than for a program to be delivered. And that obviously helps the agency quite a lot, because it's easier to sell. They don't pay if these impacts haven't been delivered. I hope that makes sense, Andrew. If not, please feel free to ask again.
Thanks, Christian. That makes perfect sense.
Does it? I
Yep.
feel like I didn't hit the nail here.
No, it's fine. I mean, I'm kind of coming back to this after a couple of years, so I'm a little bit rusty, but everything that you've just mentioned really does kind of remind me of some of the stuff we talked about a while ago. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew. Just want to put it very clearly, Andrew, and everybody else, a commercial service contract pays for a result, or pays for a service delivery at least. Whereas a grant pays for the delivery of a program and a schedule of activities. And that seems like a very obvious separation, but it has significant project management implications. Oh, that was clearer. Bindya Vashani, sorry for pronouncing your name probably wrong. You are asking the question that the private sector has CV databases for tenders, which is usually key evaluation criteria. How should NGOs approach this? Bindya, it's a really good question, very detailed. You are right. Not just the private sector, also many NGOs have CV databases. The good answer is that very few commercial contractors these days run their own CV database anymore. This is usually outsourced. There are specialized firms for this. There are services for this. There's even a subsection of LinkedIn, which allows you to draw in experts quite a lot more. So that having a whole host and some CV management system used to be a thing from, say, 5 years ago. Usually that is now outsourced, where the candidates update their own information all the time. Otherwise, what we always find is that any organization running its own CV database, the database pretty much becomes useless after only 6 to 8 months because the data becomes old. And there are so good solutions. And in these solutions, an NGO and INGO can tap in, just like every other commercial contractor, to put a price on it. The LinkedIn recruitment account, I think, costs you something around the region of $25 a month or something like this. It's really cheap. And I've seen this working better than the more expensive CV databases that some of the contractors hold. So that's actually an easy one there. I would strongly recommend doing that. Good, Bindya, I hope that's very useful. Good, thanks for that comment. That's 4 questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. Is there anybody else who would like to say a word, ask any questions, discuss with you your experience about commercial contracts? Oh, sorry, Alejandro, you asked one more question. Alma, you asked, is there any sample generic manual for the management of commercial contracts? No, there isn't. Commercial contracts, like grants, really range from thematically from all kinds of the world, from infrastructure all the way to social justice. We've seen service contracts appearing now for the investigation of war crimes in the Ukraine, right down to child poverty beating in the US, right down to addressing root causes of migration in Latin America. It's as diverse as the entire aid and development agenda is, which is good because this means there's probably a fair number of commercial contracts in whatever area it is you work, which is bad because I'm afraid there isn't a generic manual for it. I hope that wasn't really helpful, but that's, I'm afraid, is all we can say about it there. Wonderful. Are there any other comments? Andrew, go ahead.
Thanks, Christian. You mentioned the EU frameworks that are coming up in the summer.
Yes.
Do you have any information on, excuse me, the INDF from FCDO that was due to be procured? If I remember rightly, I think there's going to be a market engagement event back in March, but it was cancelled. And as far as I've seen, there hasn't been an update since then, unless I've missed it.
Funny you say this. I had exactly the same question earlier today from another person. So would you terribly mind dropping me a line, and then I'll reach out to our FCDO resident consultant and ask them where they are. I am at FCDO myself next Monday, meeting the department heads. So hopefully I can ask that question. But I know you and a million others have been asking questions, not just about this, but other pipeline events that have been in the back. We were all hoping, or sort of maybe unjustifiably hoping, that after the Queen's speech last night, it would finally unplug or unrelease. But that, I'm not sure that will happen, to be honest.
Okay, thanks. I'll drop you a message after this.
Yeah, I'll try to find out. This is not the only contract that has been stuck with FCDO. And in fairness, the EU isn't much better. But the frameworks, the only thing we know about the EU is that the frameworks cannot be extended any further. So we're pretty certain they will have to release them before the summer break in August, which means, usually what they do is they ruin our summer holidays by releasing at the back end of June or July. They're very good at ruining summer holidays. Great. I'll put my email address into the chat again. On that, Andrew and everybody else, the German KfW and the German BMZ have also released an increased use of commercial contracts in the Mediterranean region, including Northern Africa, and on the rebuilding of what is the western side of Ukraine. So that showcases again that the commercial contract usage is on the rise, even in a very tender, grant-friendly environment like Germany, which by now is the third largest and the fourth largest direct aid giver, so not to be sniffed at. Great. Unless there's any other questions, I think we're going to call it a day here. Yeah, there are more resources about, every 10 questions. Oh, and you asked me whether I can repost my email address. I've just done that. Let me just show my email address as well. Hang on a second. You can also go to the MzN page and find a lot more resources about questions every proposal should answer, commercial contract insights, strategic management of pipelines, etc. That's all on the blog there. And if you can't find it or just want to have a direct contact, by all means, please do reach out to me. I appreciate that this was a 20 minutes, very quick look at a very large topic. I hope it helped nonetheless, and that you take something away from that. As I said, the recording and the slides of this webinar will be shared with you in the next few days by my colleague, Deborah. And if you got any wish to talk about this before then or after that, please feel free to just reach out. Final questions? Are there any more questions with you? No? Okay, thank you so much, everybody. I'll wish that you all stay healthy and happy, and I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, or maybe in person very soon. Bye for now.